Mark stood at the edge of his backyard where the grass ended and the dust began. The ground was a map of neglect, cracked and hardened by seasons of neglect. Beyond the wooden fence, the world was alive. He heard the rhythmic snip of garden shears and the murmur of neighbors tending to soil that yielded life with every touch. Their gardens were thick with color, overflowing with vines that climbed high and leaves that caught the light. He looked down at his own land. Nothing grew here but the stubborn, gray weeds that had claimed the dirt for years. He kicked at a dry clod of earth, watching it crumble into fine, dead powder. The silence of his own yard felt heavy, a stark wall between him and the life pulsing just a few feet away. Every time the wind shifted, it carried the scent of damp earth and blooming petals from across the property line. It was a reminder of what he had allowed to wither. He turned his gaze toward the far corner, where the weeds were tall enough to hide his boots, and let out a long, slow breath. He was the only thing standing in the center of this hollow, empty space. The contrast was a physical weight, pulling his shoulders down, turning the afternoon heat into something stifling and absolute. Mark reached into his pocket and withdrew a single dry packet. The paper was worn, the edges frayed from being handled in the dark. He held it with both hands, feeling the tiny, hard shapes inside shift against the paper. This was the only thing he had brought to change the landscape. He looked back at the vast expanse of gray dust stretching out before him. The silence of the yard seemed to amplify the crinkle of the packet. He shook it gently, listening to the dry rattle, then pressed the packet against his palm as if trying to transfer its potential into his own skin. The soil ahead was vast and unyielding, a graveyard of lost seasons. He looked from the small paper promise in his hand to the daunting horizon of dead dirt. The task was not just to plant, but to break a cycle that had hardened over years. He took a steadying breath, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the packet tighter. He was no longer just looking at the neglect. He was holding the instrument of its end. The sun beat down, turning the dust to heat, but he did not look away. He calculated the distance, the effort, and the sheer impossibility of what he intended to do. He stared at the dry ground, waiting for the moment his resolve would finally overcome his hesitation. Mark lowered himself, his knees sinking into the dry, unyielding dust. He placed the packet aside and reached for the ground. The soil felt like grit against his palms, abrasive and cold despite the sun. He targeted a small, isolated patch near the center of the yard. His fingers brushed against a thick, woody vine that had anchored itself deep into the earth. He gripped the stem and pulled. It held fast. The plant did not want to leave the ground it had claimed for so long. Mark leaned back, shifting his weight, and yanked again. The vine groaned, the dry dirt around its base fracturing under the tension. He felt the resistance in his shoulders, a sharp ache that mirrored the doubt he had carried for years. He twisted his wrist, applying leverage to the root system, and with a sudden snap, the vine came free. A handful of debris followed it. He brushed the loose soil away with his palm, sweeping the surface until the earth was bare and dark. He stared at that small, clean square. It was only a few inches wide, but it was the first time in a decade that this patch of land had been open to the sky. He wiped his face with his forearm, leaving a streak of dust, and reached for the seeds. Mark did not stop after the first vine. He moved to the next, then the next, his movements becoming a methodical rhythm. The ground was a web of interlocking roots, each one fighting to stay buried. He dug his fingers into the hardened crust, ignoring the grit that worked its way under his fingernails. A sharp, jagged edge of a root sliced across his palm, leaving a thin line of red. He looked at his hand, the skin raw and weeping, but he did not pull away. He gripped the next vine even tighter, feeling the burn of the abrasion against the dry earth. Every yank was a rejection of the neglect that had defined his backyard. He pulled until his shoulders ached and his breath came in ragged gasps. The pile of discarded, prickly debris grew beside him, a testament to the effort he had long withheld. He was clearing away years of procrastination with every handful of soil. His palms stung with every movement, but the pain provided a strange, grounding focus. He swept another section clean, his hands now smeared with dirt and blood, yet he kept his gaze fixed on the next patch. He was stripping the land of its stubborn history, preparing the ground to receive what he was about to plant. Mark knelt in the center of the small, cleared patch. He opened his palm. The seed was tiny, a fragile speck against the vast, dry expanse of the backyard. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its weightless potential. For a second, he looked at the surrounding dust and wondered if this single point of effort could ever truly change the landscape. The silence of the yard felt heavy. Mocking his ambition, he stared at the seed, then down at the dark, exposed soil. He did not hesitate further. He pressed his finger into the earth, creating a small, perfect indentation. He placed the seed inside. It vanished into the dark, hidden from the harsh glare of the sun. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly from the previous labor, and pushed the loose dirt back over the spot. He patted the ground flat with his palm, smoothing the surface till the seed was completely sealed away. He kept his hand there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the ground. He had spent years dreaming of change, but this was the first time he had actually forced it to begin. He sat back on his heels, his breathing slowing. The patch was no longer just dirt. It was a promise. The sun rose and fell, and Mark was there. Each morning, he walked to the edge of the yard, the dew still clinging to his boots. The soil remained brown, a vast, stubborn expanse that refused to show a single sprout. He did not look for results. He looked for the next square of dirt. He cleared, he dug, he placed the seeds. The movements became ingrained, a language of muscle and repetition. He stopped checking the sky for rain or the ground for change. He simply performed the work. The neighbors watched from their windows, but their curiosity no longer held his attention. He was caught in the gravity of his own routine. His trowel became an extension of his hand, clicking against stones and slicing through dense clay with a steady, dull thud. There was a comfort in the repetition, a steady heartbeat of effort that ignored the silence of the garden. He was no longer waiting for the harvest. He was defined by the labor itself. He moved down the line, row by row, day by day, until the entire patch was turned. His muscles grew accustomed to the strain. His mind quieted, shedding the frantic desire for progress. He was not just working the land. He was building a rhythm that could not be broken by the stillness of the dirt. The sky turned into a white, blinding sheet. By noon, the heat sat heavy on the yard, turning the dust into a fine, choking grit. Mark hauled the buckets from the pump, the handles biting into his palms. Water sloshed over the rim, vanishing instantly into the parched earth before it could even soak the roots. Each trip back and forth felt longer. The weight of the iron buckets pulled his shoulders down, his muscles burning with every step. He reached the edge of the patch, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He tipped the water out, watching it darken the soil for a heartbeat before the sun drank it dry again. He stumbled, his knee hitting the hard ground with a dull jar. He stayed there, hands pressed into the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sun beat down on his back, relentless and unforgiving. He wiped sweat from his eyes, leaving streaks of mud across his forehead. He looked at the row of seeds, then back at the empty, shimmering horizon. Every gallon of water felt like a gamble. Every ounce of his strength was being poured into a barren void. He sat back, his chest heaving, wondering if the soil would ever hold anything but his own exhaustion. The silence of the yard began to press inward. Mark remained on his knees, his palms pressed flat against the unyielding dirt. A thought flickered in the back of his mind, cold and sharp. It whispered that the earth was too hard, too dead, and that his persistence was nothing more than a slow waste of time. He watched a single ant navigate a crack in the crust, its path aimless and futile. The voice grew louder, suggesting that the neighbors were right to walk away. He felt the weight of his own fatigue settling into his bones, a heavy, dragging sensation that made standing up feel impossible. The sun offered no warmth, only a glare that exposed every failure in the landscape. He closed his eyes, leaning forward until his forehead brushed the grit. The doubt was a tangible pressure, a force trying to push him backward. He gripped the soil, his knuckles turning white against the brown earth. Then he forced a breath out. He didn't look at the horizon. He didn't look at the neighbors' fences. He shifted his weight, pushed his palms into the dust, and knelt again. He picked up his trowel, cleared a new patch, and pressed the metal deep into the ground. He had made his choice. The doubt remained, but Mark stopped listening to the words. He turned his attention to the grit under his nails. He traced the fine lines of the soil, feeling the texture of the earth as it crumbled between his thumb and forefinger. He cleared a circle, pushed the debris aside, and focused on the exact depth of the hole. 1 inch. 2. He dropped the seed in, covered it, and patted the surface firm. Then, he moved to the next spot. He stopped planning. He stopped calculating the probability of success. He stopped imagining the potential for failure. He replaced the mental noise with the physical cadence of the work. Reach, dig, plant, cover. His hands moved with a mechanical precision that left no room for hesitation. He felt the tension in his shoulders soften as he traded the habit of overthinking for the habit of planting. His world shrunk to the 6 inches of dirt directly in front of him. When his mind drifted toward the future, he pulled his focus back to the immediate sensation of the cold earth against his skin. The cycle became his anchor. He planted row after row, his movements becoming fluid and unhurried. He was no longer waiting for a harvest. He was simply occupied with the labor of the present moment. The rhythm held for a long time. Mark was knee-deep in the dirt, his trowel biting into the crust of the earth with a consistent, metallic scrape. He reached for the next seed, his movements fluid and precise. Then, the light shifted. A sudden, cold shadow stretched across the patch of ground he was tending, swallowing the warmth of the afternoon sun. Mark did not look up immediately. He finished pressing the seed into the furrow, his thumb smoothing the soil over the top. The temperature in the yard seemed to drop. He heard the faint, dry creak of wood against wood, the sound of someone leaning their weight against the fence line. He remained hunched over, his hands still caked with the dark, stubborn dust of the yard. The silence that followed was not the quiet of the garden. It was heavy, filled with the weight of an unasked question. He felt eyes on his back, tracking every movement of his mud-stained fingers. He waited. He kept his head down, his focus locked on the tiny, barren square of earth he had yet to clear. The air between them grew thick, pressurized by the unspoken scrutiny of a neighbor watching a man labor over a patch of nothing. Mark finally stopped his hand. He gripped the handle of his trowel, braced his knees against the ground, and slowly turned his head toward the fence. The neighbor stood framed against the afternoon sky, arms crossed over the top rail of the fence. His face was unreadable, a mask of casual pity that stung more than direct criticism. He looked down at the expanse of dry, cracked earth, then back at Mark. "Why bother?" the neighbor asked. The words cut through the air, simple and devastating. They landed in the silence like stones. Mark felt the question settle deep in his chest. It was not just about the garden. It was a challenge to every hour he had spent in the dust. For a fleeting second, the image of his neighbor's lush, vibrant lawns flashed in his mind, highlighting the emptiness of his own plot. He looked at his raw, dirt-streaked palms. He looked at the barren ground that had given him nothing in return for his sweat. The doubt he had spent weeks burying suddenly clawed its way to the surface. He felt the weight of the neighbor's gaze, waiting for a justification that Mark wasn't sure he could put into words. Was he chasing a dream? Or was he merely wasting his life on a patch of dirt that refused to bloom? He kept his mouth shut, fighting to keep the logic of his work separate from the desire for the neighbor's approval. Mark did not offer a response. The question hung between them, a fragile thing that withered under the sheer weight of his indifference. He turned his gaze away from the neighbor and dropped his eyes back to the earth. His fingers found the base of a dry, stubborn weed that had eluded him for days. He gripped the stalk, felt the resistance of the roots, and gave a sharp, controlled pull. The earth yielded. He tossed the tangle aside, his movements devoid of hesitation. He smoothed the soil with the edge of his palm, finding a fresh, clean spot of dirt. He reached into his pocket, drew out a single seed, and pressed it deep into the dark, waiting ground. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge the figure at the fence. He simply reached for the next weed, his hands working with a renewed, mechanical focus that shut out the world. Every movement was a rejection of the doubt offered to him. He was not there to explain his labor. He was there to complete it. The neighbor stood for a heartbeat longer, then shifted, the wood of the fence groaning as he turned away. Mark stayed knelt, his hands buried deep in the dust, committed to the next row. The seasons bled into one another, marked only by the change in the sun's angle and the steady, rhythmic movement of Mark's hands. What began as a desperate struggle against the dust transformed into a silent, relentless discipline. His palms grew thick with calluses, the skin hardening against the bite of the soil and the resistance of the weeds. He no longer fought the earth, he negotiated with it. one seed at a time. The procrastination that once clouded his mornings vanished, burned away by the simple necessity of the next task. He moved with a heavy, steady grace. When the heat hit its peak, he did not seek the shade. When the rains turned the dirt to thick, clinging clay, he did not pause. His body adapted to the strain, his muscles tightening into a wire-like tension that demanded motion. He had stopped calculating the time or checking the horizon for results. The labor itself became the reward. He operated in a blur of repetition, his mind clear, his focus sharpened to the singular point of the trowel hitting the dirt. The habit of planting had fully consumed the habit of doubt, forging a new, unwavering rhythm in his chest that matched the slow, steady turning of the seasons. The fear that once gripped his chest had evaporated, replaced by the cool, mechanical certainty of his routine. Mark no longer scanned the horizon for signs of growth or sought validation from the fence line. The desire for a quick result had been discarded, a useless weight he had finally dropped. He understood now that the act of kneeling was the victory. He pushed the trowel into the earth, feeling the resistance of the soil against the steel blade with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Every motion was precise, stripped of wasted energy or nervous hesitation. He found a strange, deep peace in the repetition, in the way his muscles responded to the familiar strain without protest. His character had become as dense and steady as the ground he worked. He did not need the harvest to justify the labor. The labor had already justified him. He reached into his pouch, withdrew a seed, and placed it with the steady hand of a man who owned his time. He was not waiting for the future to arrive. He was constructing it, one square of dirt at a time. The silence in the yard was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his own resolve, a solid, tangible presence that had completely overwritten the man who had stood there months before, paralyzed by doubt. The sun had barely crested the roofline when Mark walked to the back of his lot. It was a morning like any other, the air cool and damp against his skin. He knelt, trowel in hand, ready to begin the familiar cycle of turning the soil. He pressed his hand into the dirt, feeling for the next spot to clear. Then, he stopped. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he scanned the surface of the earth. There, emerging from the dark, packed clay, was a tiny, jagged sliver of green. He held his breath, fearing that even a sharp intake of air might crush it. He brushed a loose particle of dust away with the tip of his finger. The shoot was real. It was stiff, vibrant, and undeniably alive. A second one appeared just inches away, pushing through the crust of the soil with surprising force. He felt a jolt of electricity move up his spine. The months of unseen work, the long hours in the heat, the doubts he had buried alongside the seeds, all of it culminated in this single, fragile point of life. He did not move for a long time. He simply watched the sunlight catch the dew on the tiny leaf, his heart hammering against his ribs. The invisible work had finally broken through. It was not luck. It was the result. Bates' transformation did not happen in a single moment, but it felt like an explosion of color across the brown earth. Where there had been only dust, there were now rows of deep, saturated petals pulsing in the morning light. Crimson, gold, and violet flooded the yard, overwhelming the senses. Mark stood at the edge of the patch, watching as the garden expanded. Each row he had tended with such precision now held a distinct, vibrant life of its own. The air became thick with the scent of damp soil and sweet nectar, a stark contrast to the sterile, dry scent that had defined this space for years. He walked between the rows, his boots sinking into the rich, soft earth. The flowers reached toward the sky, swaying in a gentle rhythm that matched the steady pulse of his own breathing. He reached out, his calloused fingertips brushing the velvet edge of a petal, feeling the cool, firm texture of his labor. The density of the growth was staggering. It was no longer a patch of dirt. It was a living, breathing tapestry of his own making. Every color represented a day of work, every stalk a moment of persistence. The backyard had been fully reclaimed, transformed from a wasteland into a vibrant, thriving sanctuary of living light. Mark stood in the very center of the space, surrounded by the vibrant results of his dedication. He looked down at his hands, thick with calluses and stained by the dark earth. These hands had once trembled with doubt, but now they held a steady, quiet strength. He turned slowly, taking in the rows of color he had fostered through every season of heat and exhaustion. The garden was a mirror. He realized then that he had not merely cultivated a patch of land, he had cultivated his own capacity to endure. The long, lonely months of labor had carved out a new patience within him, a deep-seated calm that had not existed before the first seed was planted. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the soil, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him. The struggle to clear the weeds, the persistence required to haul water, the refusal to quit when the ground remained hard, all of it had forged a person who was no longer defined by the barrenness of the past. He was different now. The garden was beautiful, but the true architecture was internal. He stood up, his posture straight, his eyes clear, understanding that the greatest harvest was the quiet power he now carried in his own heart. He looked at the trowel resting in his palm. It felt like an extension of his own arm now, balanced and familiar. He remembered the weight of the water buckets pulling at his shoulders during the heat of July. He remembered the sharp resistance of the soil when he first tried to break the hard crust of the earth. Back then, every muscle had ached, and his mind had screamed for him to stop. He had ignored the fatigue, he had ignored the doubt. That daily grind had been the furnace, and his persistence was the metal being shaped inside it. The discipline was no longer a forced habit. It had become the rhythm of his blood. He looked at the rows, then back at the empty, dusty strip of land still waiting at the far edge of the fence. He did not feel the old hesitation. He felt a quiet, steady resolve. The flowers were merely the evidence of the work. The true prize, the heavy, golden outcome of his long months, was the endurance he now carried in his heart. It was a firm, unshakable weight. He knew now that he could face any patch of dust and transform it, not because he was lucky, but because he was capable of the labor required to change the world around him. Mark looked across the rows of color, letting the late afternoon light wash over the garden. He searched for the influence of luck in the vibrant petals and the deep green leaves, but he found none. There were no shortcuts here. Every vibrant bloom was the direct consequence of a decision he had made when the sun was high and his muscles were screaming for rest. He realized that the harvest was never a matter of chance, nor was it bestowed by favorable winds. It was the cumulative weight of thousands of small, quiet choices made in the face of uncertainty. He stood in the center of the life he had built, breathing in the scent of damp earth and success. The air felt still and clear. A profound sense of mastery settled over him, a calm that reached into the marrow of his bones. He had stopped waiting for the world to change, and instead, he had changed the world one seed at a time. The doubt that once whispered in his ears had been silenced by the evidence of his own hands. He felt complete, anchored in the knowledge that his future was no longer an accident of fate, but a landscape he would continue to shape with his own deliberate, consistent actions. Mark turned away from the established rows and looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the remaining stretch of dry, unworked earth. The garden behind him was finished, a testament to months of steady, quiet labor, but he did not linger on the achievement. He understood now that the end of one cycle was merely the necessary foundation for the next. The horizon held no mystery, only opportunity. He felt the rough, familiar texture of the trowel handle against his palm, a tool that had become an extension of his own intent. Without hesitation, he walked to the edge of the dust and knelt. The soil here was hard, just as it had been at the very beginning. But that did not matter. He drove the metal blade into the ground, turning the earth over with a clean, deliberate motion. The first hole was ready. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a new seed, and pressed it into the waiting dirt. He stood up, wiped the grit from his fingers, and took a step forward to prepare the next spot. There was no end to the work, and in that realization he found the freedom to keep growing. One row, one seed, and one day at a time.